March 27th, 2022. The Dolby Theater in Los Angeles. A comedian named Chris Rock stands under the lights, delivers a joke about a woman's shaved head, and within seconds, one of the most beloved entertainers in the history of American pop culture walks onto that stage and strikes him across the face on live television, in front of the film industry's most powerful people, in front of a global audience of 30 million viewers. Less than an hour later, that same man is standing at a podium, tears streaming down his face, accepting the Academy Award for Best Actor. 2 moments. One night, a career built across 4 decades compressed into a single evening that would follow him everywhere he went for the rest of his life. This is a story of what happens after the world watches its favorite person become someone it no longer recognizes, and what it costs a man to try to find his way back from that. For most of his adult life, Will Smith represented something specific to American audiences. Not just talent, though he had plenty of it. Not just charisma, though few performers in Hollywood history have possessed as much of it as naturally as he did. He represented a kind of promise. The idea that discipline, humor, and relentless effort could take a person from nothing to everything, and that the climb itself could look effortless if you smiled through it. That promise made him one of the most bankable stars on the planet for the better part of 30 years. It also made the events of that March evening feel less like a celebrity scandal and more like a personal betrayal to millions of people who felt, in some strange parasocial way, that they had grown up alongside him. And in the years since, Will Smith has been engaged in something far more complicated than a public relations recovery. He has been trying to answer a question that has no clean resolution. What do you do when the worst thing you have ever done in public becomes permanently attached to the best thing you have ever achieved? To understand why this moment cut so deep, it helps to go back to where the persona was built in the first place. Willard Carroll Smith, too, grew up in Winfield, a neighborhood in West Philadelphia, the son of a refrigeration engineer and a school board employee. By his own account in interviews over the years, his household was structured and demanding, shaped by a father who believed discipline was the foundation of everything worth having. Will has spoken publicly, including in his 2021 memoir, Will, co-written with Mark Manson, about how his childhood shaped the performer he would become. In that book, he described watching his father strike his mother when he was a child, a memory he has said filled him with a shame he carried for years, a shame tied specifically to the idea that he had failed to protect her in that moment. He wrote candidly about how that unresolved feeling of powerlessness shaped his adult relationship with control, with proving himself, and with the fear of ever again standing by while someone he loved was hurt or humiliated. Reading that memoir today, in the shadow of the Oscar stage, gives the incident a different weight. It does not excuse it, but it complicates the easy narrative that a joke about his wife simply made him angry for a moment. According to his own account, the roots of that reaction ran back decades. Before he was an actor, Will Smith was a rapper. Alongside DJ Jazzy Jeff, he built a career on some of the most accessible, family-friendly hip-hop of the late 1980s, winning the first ever Grammy Award given in the rap category for Parents Just Don't Understand in 1989. But commercial success did not translate into financial security. Smith has spoken in multiple interviews about spending recklessly during that period, buying cars and jewelry and property well beyond what his income could sustain, and about the moment the Internal Revenue Service came calling for millions of dollars in unpaid taxes. He has described that period as one of the most frightening of his young life, a moment when the fame was real, but the financial ground beneath him had completely disappeared. It was in that moment of crisis that NBC came call with an offer for a new sitcom loosely based on his own life, a show that would become the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That series, which ran from 1990 to 1996, did more than rescue him financially. It built the persona that would carry him for the next 3 decades. Audiences fell in love with a character who was funny, quick, occasionally reckless, but fundamentally warm-hearted. A kid who could crack jokes in one scene and break down crying in another. The show's most quietly devastating moment, an unscripted scene where Smith's character asks his absent father why he never wanted him, is still cited by television critics and by Smith himself as one of the realest pieces of acting he has ever done, precisely because so much of it drew on his own complicated relationship with his father. Even in a network sitcom built for laughs, there were signs of the emotional range that would eventually define his film career and signs in hindsight of exactly how much pain he had learned to fold into a performance without letting the audience feel the weight of it. From there, Smith made a series of calculated moves that few actors in Hollywood history have replicated. He has said in interviews that he studied the 10 highest-grossing films of all time and noticed patterns, effects, creatures, love stories, and used that analysis to choose his next projects with something close to scientific precision. Whether or not that account is a slight exaggeration for effect, the results speak for themselves. Bad Boys in 1995 proved he could anchor an action franchise. Independence Day in 1996 turned him into a certified global blockbuster star. Men in Black in 1997 made him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. By the turn of the millennium, Will Smith was arguably the biggest movie star alive, a rare performer who could open a film purely on the strength of his name, regardless of genre. But it was a dramatic work that revealed the fuller picture of what he was capable of. His portrayal of Muhammad Ali in the 2001 film Ali, directed by Michael Mann, earned him his first Academy Award nomination and required him to physically and emotionally transform himself for the role, training as a boxer for over a year. Then came The Pursuit of Happiness in 2006, a film based on the real life of entrepreneur Chris Gardner, in which Smith played a father navigating homelessness with his young son while trying to build a career as a stockbroker. The film earned him a second Oscar nomination and became, for many people, the defining image of what Will Smith represented as a public figure, a man who refuses to quit, who protects his child at all costs, who turns desperation into determination. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it stands in such stark, almost unbearable contrast to what would eventually take place on that Oscar stage 2 decades later, a moment that also involved protecting someone he loved, but that unfolded in front of the entire world as something closer to a rupture than a triumph. Not every chapter of that era was a success story. In 2013, Smith starred alongside his son Jaden in After Earth, a science fiction film he had personally developed with the intention of establishing Jaden as a new kind of action star. The film was a critical and commercial disappointment, and Smith has spoken candidly in later interviews about how painful that period was, not just professionally but personally, because the failure was so tightly wound up with his hopes for his son's future. It was an early signal of something that would recur throughout his life, his tendency to blend personal ambition, family legacy, and public performance into a single project, a habit that could produce something as beautiful as The Pursuit of Happiness or as painful as watching a film built around his son get dismantled by critics. By the 2010s, Will and Jada Pinkett Smith had also become something unusual in celebrity culture, a couple who spoke openly, sometimes uncomfortably openly, about the difficulties inside their marriage. Their Facebook Watch series Red Table Talk, which launched in 2018, became a platform for candid conversations about topics most celebrity marriages kept firmly behind closed doors. In 2020, Jada disclosed on the show that she had been involved in what she described as an entanglement with musician August Alsina during a period when she and Will were living separately, though still legally married. The revelation became a cultural moment in its own right, spawning countless memes and becoming a kind of shorthand for the unconventional nature of their relationship. Will addressed it directly in interviews at the time, describing the pain of learning about the relationship and the process the two of them went through to rebuild trust. What stood out to many observers was not the disclosure itself, but the fact that the couple chose to discuss it so openly on camera for an audience of millions. It was consistent with everything they had built together. Total transparency as both a philosophy and, whether intended or not, a form of content. That openness would later prove to be a double-edged sword. In her 2023 memoir, Worthy, Jada revealed that she and Will had actually been living separately since 2016, years before the public had any indication that anything was wrong. She described their relationship in the years since as something that did not fit conventional definitions, remaining connected as co-parents and life partners while no longer functioning as a traditional married couple. Will, for his part, has said in subsequent interviews that reading parts of the memoir was difficult, and that some of what became public was not something he had chosen to reveal in that way. The public reaction was intense. Commentators debated what the revelation meant. Whether it recontextualized years of red carpet appearances and interviews in which the two are presented as a united couple, and whether audiences had any right to feel misled by two people who had simply been managing an unconventional relationship in a way that felt right to them. There is no way to fully know from the outside what that private negotiation actually looked like day to day. What is clear is that by the time the Oscar night arrived in March of 2022, the Smiths had already spent years living inside a level of public scrutiny that most marriages, complicated or not, would struggle to survive. Which brings us back to that stage. Chris Rock's joke referenced Jada's shaved head, a reference to the alopecia diagnosis she had spoken about publicly in 2018 after noticing sudden hair loss, a condition she described at the time as terrifying precisely because it felt like losing control over her own body in front of the world. Rock's joke suggested she looked like she was in a sequel to G.I. Jane. The cameras caught Jada's visible reaction, an eye roll, a flash of something that read as hurt. Will laughed initially. Then, according to the accounts of people in the room and the footage itself, something shifted. He stood up, walked onto the stage, and struck Rock across the face. He returned to his seat and, according to broadcast audio, shouted for Rock to keep his wife's name out of his mouth, repeating it a second time with more intensity. What followed in the room was a strange, suspended silence, the kind that happens when several thousand people simultaneously try to determine whether what they just witnessed was a stunt or something real. It was real. Rock, visibly stunned but composed, continued hosting. And less than an hour later, Denzel Washington announced Will Smith as the winner of the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance as Richard Williams, the father and coach of Venus and Serena Williams, in King Richard. Smith walked the stage again, this time to accept the award, and deliver a speech that has been analyzed and reanalyzed more than almost any acceptance speech in Oscar history. He apologized to the Academy and to his fellow nominees, but notably did not apologize to Chris Rock in that moment. He spoke about being a protector, referencing Richard Williams' own fierce protectiveness of his daughters, and described crying throughout the day. He said that art imitates life, that he looked like the crazy father, just as people said Richard Williams was, and that love makes you do crazy things. The speech has been described by some as raw and human, a man trying to process an overwhelming night in real time in front of an audience that had no context for what he was feeling. Others have described it as tone deaf, an attempt to reframe an act of violence as an expression of devotion. Both readings, in a sense, can be true at once. That is part of what makes the incident so difficult to sit with. It was not a simple story about a bad man doing a bad thing. It was a complicated man with a long, documented history of channeling pain into performance, having a very public breakdown in real time, followed immediately by the single greatest professional validation of his career. The whiplash of that sequence, shame and triumph collapsed into the same 50 minutes. Maybe one of the strangest things to ever happen on a live broadcast watched by tens of millions of people. The consequences arrived quickly. Smith resigned from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences before the organization could formally act. The Academy's Board of Governors then voted to ban him from attending any Academy events, including the Oscar ceremony itself, for 10 years. Smith released a formal apology to Chris Rock roughly a day after the incident, and a longer, more detailed apology video months later, in which he addressed Rock directly, acknowledged that his behavior was unacceptable, and said he had reached out to Rock privately but had been told Rock was not ready to talk. He also, in that same video, apologized to Rock's mother and family, to the Williams family whose story King Richard told, and to the audience who had trusted him for so long. Rock, for his part, largely avoided detailed public commentary on the incident for the better part of a year, before addressing it at length in his 2023 Netflix comedy special Selective Outrage, where he described the impact of the slap in blunt terms and made clear that he had not accepted the private apology in the way Smith's public statements implied. What makes this period so hard to watch is not simply the slap itself, which lasted seconds, or even the ban, which was a defined and finite consequence. It is the open-endedness of everything that came after. There is no formal mechanism in celebrity culture for a scandal to be declared resolved. A prison sentence has an end date. A public apology does not. Smith was left in a position that very few people in the history of modern fame have had to navigate. Immensely talented, commercially still valuable, but permanently associated with a moment of violence that played out in front of the entire world. With no clear timeline for when or whether the public would consider the account settled. That tension became especially visible with the release of Emancipation later in 2022, a historical drama in which Smith played an enslaved man who escapes a Louisiana plantation, based loosely on the real story behind the famous Whip Peter photograph. Under any other circumstances, the film would likely have been discussed as a serious, physically demanding dramatic performance, the kind of role that often generates awards conversation. Instead, much of the media coverage focused on whether the film's release, timed for award season less than a year after the slap, was appropriate, and whether audiences and industry voters were prepared to engage with Smith's work again so soon. Apple, which released the film, made a deliberate choice to keep its awards campaign relatively quiet, and while the film received some recognition, it did not generate the kind of sustained awards conversation or performance of that caliber might have earned in a different year. It became one of the clearest examples of how thoroughly one moment can reshape the reception of everything that follows it, regardless of the quality of the work itself. In the years since, Smith has approached his return to public life carefully, in stages, rather than all at once. He gave a lengthy interview in 2022 on Trevor Noah's The Daily Show, his first major sit-down interview after the incident, where he again apologized directly to Chris Rock and described the period since the Oscars as one of deep reflection. He has spoken about undergoing what is described as therapy and inner work, and about trying to understand the specific psychological triggers that led him to react the way he did. Whether or not that process has been effective is not something any outside observer can verify. What can be observed is a pattern of his public choices since. Fewer talk show appearances built purely around charm, and more interviews that address the incident directly, almost as though he understands that skipping over it, even briefly, would read as evasive to an audience that is actively watching for signs of denial. His return to the film industry came gradually. In 2024, he starred in Bad Boys, Ride or Die, the fourth installment in the buddy cop franchise that first made him a movie star nearly 30 years earlier, alongside longtime co-star Martin Lawrence. The film performed well commercially, becoming one of the more successful releases of that summer, and was widely interpreted as a signal that a meaningful portion of the audience was still willing to show up for him, at least within the safety of a familiar, nostalgic franchise. Commentators were quick to note, however, that box office performance for a legacy sequel is not the same thing as broad cultural forgiveness. A person can buy a movie ticket out of nostalgia for a character while still holding complicated feelings about the actor playing him. The film's success demonstrated that Will Smith was not commercially finished. It did not demonstrate that the underlying rupture with the public had healed. He also returned to music, releasing new material and performing live for the first time in years, including an appearance at Coachella in 2025 that drew significant media attention, in part because it showed him back in one of the arenas that first made him famous, decades before Hollywood, and in part because critics and fans alike parsed his lyrics and stage presence for signs of what he might be trying to say about the years since 2022. That scrutiny illustrates one of the more difficult realities of his current situation. Almost nothing he creates now is allowed to simply exist as art. Every song is read as commentary. Every interview is treated as evidence. Every public appearance becomes, in some sense, a referendum on whether enough time has passed, whether the apology has been sufficient, whether the man on stage has actually changed or is simply performing change for an audience that has learned to be suspicious of performance. This is, in many ways, the defining condition of his post-2022 life, and it is worth sitting with because it says as much about contemporary celebrity culture as it does about Will Smith individually. The internet does not allow for the kind of gradual, quiet fading of a controversy that used to be possible in earlier eras of fame. Footage of the slap remains permanently searchable, permanently shareable, permanently capable of resurfacing at the exact moment a new project is released. Every anniversary of the ceremony brings renewed conversation. Every new film invites a fresh round of the same questions. There is no natural point at which the story is allowed to conclude, because the platforms that shape modern celebrity discourse are structurally built to keep resurfacing the most dramatic, most clip-friendly moment in a person's history, regardless of how much time has passed or how the person has behaved since. For a man whose entire public identity had been built around being liked, around walking into a room, and making people feel at ease. This new condition represents a genuinely different kind of challenge than anything he faced earlier in his career. The professional setbacks of the past, the tax troubles of his 20s, the disappointment of After Earth, were the kind of obstacles that could be overcome to the strategy he had always relied on. Work harder. Choose the next project carefully. Let a new success gradually replace the memory of the last failure. The Oscar incident does not respond to that strategy in the same way, because it is not primarily a professional failure. It is a moment that revealed something about his emotional control in a moment of extreme pressure, broadcast to the entire world, involving people he loves. No box office number erases that. No awards nomination undoes it. The only thing that can plausibly change a story over time is sustained, consistent behavior, demonstrated privately and publicly over years. And even then, a meaningful portion of the audience may simply never fully separate him from that night, no matter what he does afterward. There is something instructive in the way Smith has spoken about this dynamic himself. In interviews since 2022, he has repeatedly used language about accepting that not everyone will forgive him, and about trying to build a life that does not depend entirely on regaining universal approval. Whether that represents genuine acceptance or simply the most functional way to publicly frame an unresolvable situation is impossible to know from the outside. But it does suggest an awareness, at minimum, that the old model, the one built around being everyone's favorite entertainer, is no longer available to him in the way it once was. The version of Will Smith that exists now is inevitably a more complicated figure, admired by some, distrusted by others, watched closely by nearly everyone. It is worth acknowledging, too, that his marriage remains part of this ongoing public story, whether he wants it to be or not. In interviews following the publication of Worthy, Jada has continued to describe their relationship as something that defies simple categorization, still connected, still co-parenting their children Jaden, and Willow along with Will's son Trey from his first marriage, but not functioning as a conventional partnership. Will has largely avoided elaborating extensively on the specifics, and has instead focused his public comments on his own process of change rather than relitigating the details of the marriage itself. That relative restraint, choosing not to fully explain or defend the relationship in the way the couple once did on Red Table Talk, may itself be a sign of a shift in how he is approaching his public life. Total transparency once seemed to be a core value for the family. In the years since 2022, there are signs that both Will and Jada have become more selective about what they choose to share, perhaps having learned, at significant personal cost, how quickly openness can be transformed into public spectacle. None of this is to suggest that Will Smith's situation should be treated as a simple tragedy, or that the consequences he has faced are undeserved. He struck another person on a stage in front of the world, and the criticism that followed, along with the Academy's formal sanctions, were a direct and appropriate response to that action. What makes his current chapter compelling, rather than simply a cautionary tale, is the ongoing, unresolved nature of what comes next. He is not a man who disappeared. He is not a man who was fully welcomed back, without qualification either. He exists in the harder, less cinematic space in between, continuing to work, continuing to create, continuing to face an audience that is divided about how to feel toward him, and continuing to live with the knowledge that his single greatest professional achievement, an Academy Award for performance about fatherhood and protection, will likely always be remembered first for what happened in the same hour he received it. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that position that is easy to overlook when discussing a person with his level of wealth and continued opportunity. Most people who make a serious mistake in a moment of emotional overwhelm are afforded, eventually, the mercy of being forgotten, or at least the mercy of the mistake fading into a smaller part of a much longer story. Will Smith does not have access to that kind of fading. Every project he releases for the rest of his career will likely be discussed, at least in part, in relation to that night. That is an unusual weight to carry, and it does not require excusing what happened to recognize that it is, in a very real sense, a difficult way to have to live. What seems to be happening to Will Smith right now, in this current chapter, is less a comeback in the traditional Hollywood sense, and more a slow, uneven process of figuring out how to exist as a public person without the guarantee of unconditional approval that defined most of his adult life. He continues to release music. He continues to take film roles, including higher-profile projects reported to be in development in years since Bad Boys, Ride or Die. He continues to give interviews in which he addresses the incident directly rather than avoiding it. Whether that adds up to genuine transformation or simply a well-managed public rehabilitation is a judgment each individual viewer will have to make for themselves. And it is likely that different people will continue to reach different conclusions for years to come. What can be said with more confidence is that the easy version of this story, in which a beloved star falls from grace and either disappears entirely or triumphantly returns to exactly where he left off, does not apply here. Will Smith's reality sits in a harder territory between those two outcomes, a place with no dramatic resolution, no single interview or performance capable of closing the chapter, only the slow accumulation of choices made over time, watched by an audience that has not fully decided what it wants from him, and that may never fully agree among itself. He built his career on making people feel like everything was going to be all right. Now he is left facing a much more uncertain question, not whether the world will forgive him, because that is ultimately out of his control, but whether he can build a version of his life and his work that has value to him even if it never does. It also helps to place Smith's situation within a broader pattern that has become increasingly familiar in modern celebrity culture, even if a particular version of it is more extreme than most. Public figures across entertainment, sports, and politics have, over the last decade, been forced to navigate a media environment that behaves very differently from the one that shaped earlier generations of stars. In past decades, a scandal might dominate headlines for weeks before gradually receding from public attention, replaced by the next news cycle, the next controversy, the next celebrity story. Magazines eventually stopped running the story. Television segments moved on. The footage itself was harder to access, tucked away in archives that most people never revisited. That kind of natural fading simply does not exist in the same way anymore. Algorithms that power social media platforms are specifically designed to resurface high engagement content, and few pieces of footage in recent memory generate the kind of reliable engagement that the Oscar slap does. Every award season, the clip circulates again. Every time Smith releases a new project, the footage appears alongside reviews and interviews, regardless of the actual subject matter being discussed. This is not a uniquely personal punishment inflicted on him by some coordinated effort. It is simply how attention functions now, an understanding that helps explain why the incident has retained such unusual staying power compared to controversies from earlier eras, even ones that were, by some measures, more serious. There is also a generational split worth acknowledging in how audiences have processed the story. Older viewers, the ones who grew up watching The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in the early 1990s or who saw Independence Day in theaters as young adults, often describe a specific kind of disappointment. The sense of watching someone who felt like a fixture of their own personal history behave in a way that contradicted everything that fixture had represented. Younger audiences, many of whom encountered Smith primarily through more recent films or through viral clips of the incident itself, sometimes engage with the story with less of that accumulated emotional history, treating it more as a straightforward case study in public accountability than as a personal betrayal. Both reactions are legitimate responses to the same event, filtered through very different relationships with the person at the center of it. That split partially explains why reactions to his subsequent projects have remained so inconsistent. A person who watched Smith's entire career unfold in real time is processing a different kind of loss than someone encountering him primarily through the lens of a single controversial moment. It is also worth resisting the temptation to reduce the entire story to a simple morality tale about anger management or celebrity entitlement, because doing so tends to flatten what actually seems to be a more layered situation. Smith's own account of his childhood, the specific detail about witnessing violence against his mother and feeling powerless to stop it, does not function as an excuse, and Smith himself has been careful in interviews not to present it as one. But it does offer a partial window into why a joke about his wife, delivered in a room full of people who trusted him to behave with restraint, produced a reaction disproportionate to the offense itself. Psychologists who study trauma responses, speaking generally rather than about Smith specifically, often describe how earlier experiences of witnessed violence or perceived failure to protect a loved one can create heightened, sometimes instantaneous reactions later in life when a person perceives a similar threat, even one as comparatively minor as an unkind joke in an award show. This is not a clinical diagnosis of Will Smith, which no outside observer is in a position to offer. It is simply a reminder that human behavior, Even behavior that unfolds in 3 or 4 seconds on a brightly lit stage is rarely reducible to a single, isolated cause. The role of Jada Pinkett Smith in the public narrative deserves its own careful consideration as well, because she has often been treated, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the incident, as little more than a supporting character in a story about her husband's public failure. That framing tends to obscure her own experience of that night. Sitting in the audience, visibly affected by a joke referencing a medical condition she had spent years learning to speak about publicly with courage, and then watching the aftermath of her husband's reaction play out as a referendum on his character rather than a conversation about the underlying comment that provoked it. In the years since, Jada has continued to build her own public identity independent of the incident, including through the release of her memoir and her continued work as a producer and entrepreneur. Her account of the marriage, offered in her own words, has complicated the popular narrative in ways that resist easy summary, suggesting a relationship shaped as much by mutual care and long-term commitment as by unconventional arrangements that outside observers have often struggled to categorize. Any honest accounting of what is happening to Will Smith right now has to hold space for the fact that the story is inseparable from hers, and that both of them have spent years navigating a level of public examination that very few marriages, however unconventional, are built to withstand gracefully. There's a final piece of the story worth sitting with, one that extends beyond Will Smith specifically and speaks to something larger about how audiences relate to the public figures they grow up admiring. Parasocial attachment, the one-sided emotional connection audiences form with celebrities they have never actually met, tends to intensify rather than soften over decades of exposure. People who watched Smith on their televisions as teenagers in the 1990s, who quoted his sitcom lines, who saw his action films in crowded theaters, built something that functioned at an emotional level like a long-distance relationship with a stranger. That kind of attachment makes betrayal, even perceived betrayal involving someone the audience member has never actually spoken to, feel intensely personal. It also makes forgiveness complicated in ways that mirror real relationships. Some audience members will extend a kind of patience they might offer a friend who made a serious mistake. Others will feel the specific sting of disillusionment that comes from realizing a figure they trusted was more complicated, more capable of failure, than the polished version they had constructed in their own minds. Neither reaction is wrong. Both are simply evidence of how deeply certain public figures embed themselves into the emotional lives of people who have never met them, and how much weight that embedding places on every subsequent choice that figure makes in public. That is, in the end, what makes this period of a story so difficult to watch. Not because there is cruelty in observing it, but because it is one of the more visible examples in recent memory of a very old, very human problem playing out on the largest possible stage. Achievement was supposed to be the answer. Discipline was supposed to be the shield. For decades, that formula worked, and worked spectacularly, and Will Smith became one of the most successful entertainers of his generation because of it. Then, on one night in March of 2022, all of it failed to protect him from himself. What remains is a man who has to keep living publicly with that knowledge, still working, still creating, still uncertain how the story ultimately gets remembered, and still, by every indication available to the outside world, trying. Perhaps the most honest way to close this chapter of his story, at least for now, is to resist the urge to close at all. Documentaries and profile pieces tend to crave resolution, a final scene where the arc completes itself and the audience is told definitively whether the subject was redeemed or ruined. Will Smith's situation refuses that kind of tidy ending, and forcing one onto it would be dishonest to what has actually unfolded since March of 2022. He has not vanished from public life, and he has not been fully welcomed back into it without qualification. He occupies the far more realistic, far less cinematic space of a person still in process, still working to the consequences of one unforgettable evening, while trying to build something meaningful out of the years that remain. Whatever verdict individual audience members reach about him, whether they choose to watch his next film, listen to his next song, or simply change the channel when his name appears, that verdict says as much about the complicated relationship between fame, forgiveness, and memory as it does about the man himself. His story, unfinished and unresolved, remains one of the more revealing case studies of what happens when the person the public thought they knew turns out to be, like everyone else, capable of failing in front of the very people who loved him most.